there exists a silence that offers no comfort. It doesn't accompany the settling of dust or the closing of curtains after a long day's end. Instead, it arrives with suddenness, like a door slamming shut within a dwelling you had believed to be vacant. And in its wake, it leaves behind something nameless. That was the quality of silence which descended upon Harrow Hall on the night of October 14, 1837. By morning, 43 individuals had vanished. No bodies were ever recovered. Not a single indication of conflict was ever discovered. No explanation was ever formally entered into any official ledger. Furthermore, the individuals compensated to uncover answers ceased their inquiries with a swiftness that remains unaccounted for. What remained was a plantation house still warm, its candles flickering, a dining table prepared for 9, and a silence so complete, so purposeful, that the men who first walked those grounds the next morning later confided to a neighbor that he had never in his existence felt fear toward a location the way he felt fear toward Harrow Hall. He was unable to articulate why. That inability troubled him most deeply, and it should unsettle you as well. Before we proceed with the account of Harrow Hall, if you remain unaware of what transpired that October evening in the Carolina backcountry, you are about to comprehend why this narrative was suppressed for nearly 4 decades and why those who attempted to bring it to light were quietly and systematically dissuaded from their efforts. Consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a narrative such as this one, and kindly leave a comment below letting us know your listening location tonight. Now, let us return to 1837. To comprehend what transpired at Harrow Hall, one must first understand what Harrow Hall represented. Not merely as an estate, not simply as an entry on a land document, but as a living, breathing world unto itself, operating under its own regulations, its own patterns, its own implicit codes that every resident understood without verbal instruction. The plantation was situated in the Carolina backcountry, roughly 18 miles east of a trading post designated Barracks Crossing. This location no longer appears on contemporary maps, yet it was recorded on surveying charts from the 1820s as an informal collection of structures adjacent to a creek that ultimately fed into the Pd River. The terrain itself was level and dense, the sort of landscape that seemed to consume illumination rather than reflect it, where the tree line pressed inward from all directions and the sky above the cultivated areas always seemed somehow more confined than anticipated. By autumn, the cotton that had dominated those acres through the protracted, punishing summer had already been harvested, ginned, and baled, leaving behind only the bare stalks, row after row of them, brown and fragile, stirring in the October breeze and producing a sound that one visitor once characterized as hovering somewhere between a whisper and the rattling of bones. Harrow Hall itself, the principal residence, was a 2-story timber frame structure erected in the early 1810s by a man named Cornelius Tanner. He had migrated south from Virginia with sufficient capital to acquire 500 acres and the aspiration to transform them into a lasting establishment. The dwelling was not magnificent by the standards of the grand coastal plantations, it lacked towering white columns and sweeping oak avenues leading to the entrance. However, it was sturdy and intentional, constructed in the manner characteristic of men of Cornelius Tanner's disposition. Every beam was precisely hewn, every plank fitted snugly. The kitchen existed as a detached building, as did the smokehouse and the cotton gin house. A well stood near the yard, a barn accommodated perhaps a dozen animals, and behind the main house, set back approximately 200 yards, stood the rows of slave cabins housing the men, women, and children whose labor made every aspect of Harrow Hall possible. By 1837, Cornelius Tanner had been deceased for 6 years. The plantation had passed to his sole surviving son, Elias Tanner, then 34 years old at the time of our account. He had recently married a woman named Eleanor Vance, daughter of a merchant family from Columbia, and was profoundly, almost desperately concerned with preserving the facade of prosperity that his father had labored so diligently to establish. Elias Tanner was not a cruel man in the manner that cruelty typically manifests itself. He was not prone to outbursts of rage, nor was he recognized as someone who derived pleasure from exercising authority purely for its own sake. He was, in the phrasing of a neighboring landowner who later provided testimony concerning the events of October 1837, a man who performed whatever the circumstances demanded and referred to it as order. This distinction between calculated malice and the quiet institutional violence of simply perpetuating a system is one that historians have grappled with ever since. However, the residents of those cabins behind the main house lacked the privilege of making such distinctions. For them, the nature of Elias Tanner's character mattered considerably less than the nature of the world he controlled. Eleanora Tanner presented a more complex figure than her husband. She had arrived at Harrow Hall as a bride at age 22, bringing with her a piano, 3 crates of household possessions, and a sensibility shaped by a genteel upbringing that had maintained her, for most of her life, at a comfortable remove from the realities underlying her family's prosperity. She was not uninformed. By the standards of her era and location, she was reasonably educated, and letters discovered among her papers decades later suggested a private moral struggle that she never permitted to surface visibly. What she chose to do with that struggle, or what she chose not to do, would eventually become one of the more troubling questions surrounding the events of that October night. The third member of the Tanner household, at least among those residing in the main house, was Garrett, Elias's younger brother. He occupied the 2 rooms at the rear of the second floor and had arrived at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1836 under circumstances that were never entirely clarified to anyone's satisfaction. Garrett Tanner was 28 in 1837. He had spent several years in Charleston doing what, precisely, no one was willing to state plainly, although the term debts appeared in more than one account of his history. He had come to Harrow Hall, it seemed, not from brotherly affection, but from necessity. He and Elias maintained a relationship of polite detachment. They shared meals at the same table. They did not, as far as anyone could determine, trust one another. And then there was Ward Driscoll. If any single figure in this narrative warrants careful introduction, it is Ward Driscoll. He arrived at Harrow Hall in March of 1837, 7 months before the October night that would transform the plantation into a subject of whispered speculation across 2 counties. He was hired as overseer following the abrupt departure of his predecessor, a man named Clifton Haywood, whose own leaving had been sufficiently sudden to generate its own quiet rumors. Haywood had supervised Harrow Hall's enslaved workforce for 3 years, and his departure, which occurred at night with his belongings packed and his horse saddled before anyone in the main house was awake, was not in itself an event that Elias Tanner had any particular interest in explaining. Overseers came and went, the work continued. However, Haywood's departure was not simply a professional resignation. The men and women in the cabins behind the main house possessed knowledge about why Clifton Haywood had left in darkness that Elias Tanner did not. And the arrival of Ward Driscoll, the men who replaced him, altered the atmosphere of Harrow Hall in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to overlook. Driscoll was a tall man, lean in the manner of someone who had spent years engaged in physical labor, with a pale and weathered face that seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of evaluation, as if he were constantly measuring the distance between his current position and where he needed to be. He arrived with a single letter of recommendation from a plantation near the North Carolina border, signed by a landowner named Gideon Falk, who characterized Driscoll as a man of decisive character and firm principles, well suited to managing a large property. What Falk did not mention, what was only discovered later through the patient archival work that requires decades and demands someone stubborn enough to persist, was that Driscoll had left Falk's employment under circumstances bearing a striking resemblance to the manner in which Clifton Haywood had left Harrow Hall, at night, without notice, with a silence behind him that no one wished to disturb. By the summer of 1837, the world of Harrow Hall had settled into a new rhythm under Driscoll's supervision. A rhythm that everyone within those gates could perceive, but that no official document, no letter, no record of any kind would ever fully capture. And beneath that rhythm, in the intervals between the visible and the documented, something was being planned. Something patient, something careful, something that had been years, perhaps longer, in preparation. History tends to document the names of those dwelling in the main house. It is less reliable regarding the names of those who constructed it, maintained it, supplied it with food, and made everything within it possible. Yet those names existed. They appear in fragments, in estate inventories, in church records, in the accounts of abolitionists who traveled through the South collecting testimony in the years that followed. Assembling them is one of the only honest approaches to telling this story. Reuben was 41 years old in the autumn of 1837. He had been at Harrow Hall since age 7, brought there by Cornelius Tanner from a property in Virginia, and he had spent those 34 years accumulating the kind of understanding that comes only from prolonged, close observation of a place and its inhabitants. He knew the land. He knew which section of the low field flooded during a wet spring. He knew which boards in the cotton gin creaked in a particular manner indicating they needed replacement. He knew the names of every animal in the barn and could tell from the sound of a mule's step whether it was favoring a leg. He was, in the estimation of virtually everyone who had dealings with Harrow Hall during those years, indispensable, and he had spent a significant portion of his life comprehending precisely what that meant and precisely what it did not. Reuben was tall, lean, and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had learned through long practice to express only what he chose to express. He spoke little around those in the main house, among his own people, in the cabins, during the quiet moments after work was completed and before it resumed. He was different. He was the sort of man toward whom others gravitated without quite understanding why, the way a compass needle orients itself. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he was steady in a manner that made others feel steadier. His wife, Delia, was 36. She worked in the main house, primarily in the kitchen, but also in whatever capacity Eleonora Tanner required her presence, which meant that Delia moved through the main house with a freedom of physical access that was unusual, and that, as we shall see, mattered enormously in the weeks leading up to October 14. Delia was perceptive in the manner of someone who had been compelled by circumstances to understand people quickly and completely, because understanding people was, for her, a matter of survival. She read rooms the way a sailor reads weather, with attention to subtle indicators that others might disregard. A shift in the angle of a shoulder. The way a sentence concluded a half-beat too soon. The direction a man's eyes moved when informed of something he didn't believe. She had been reading Ward Driscoll since the week he arrived, and what she read had frightened her in a way that the previous overseer, for all his faults, had not. It was not what Driscoll did that frightened her. It was the quality of attention he devoted to matters that other men in his position never troubled themselves to notice. He watched, he remembered, he catalogued. Within his first 2 months at Harrow Hall, he had learned more about the internal life of the cabins, the relationships, the small economies of trust and favor that existed among the enslaved community, than Clifton Haywood had learned in 3 years, and he had done so without appearing to try. That was what made Delia's stomach turn cold when she considered it at night. Driscoll was not careless. He was the opposite of careless. And a man like that, in the position he occupied, with the authority he held, was a different and more dangerous entity than a man who was simply brutal. The third figure at the center of this story was August. He was 19 years old, the youngest of the three in terms of the role he played in subsequent events, but not in terms of understanding. August had been born at Harrow Hall, the son of a man named Henry, who had died when August was 12, and a woman named Nora, who had been sold away to a property in Georgia when August was 15. In the 2 years since his mother's sale, he had become quieter and harder than he had been before, in the way that stone becomes harder when the water surrounding it is removed and the air reaches it. He was not bitter in any outwardly visible way. He worked with a focus that Driscoll had noted approvingly in the first weeks of his arrival, which meant that August had achieved the rare and difficult condition of being noticed as capable without being noticed as dangerous. But August possessed something that neither Reuben's steadiness nor Delia's perceptiveness could provide. He could read, not well, not fluently, but adequately. He had learned in the manner that enslaved people who learned anything in the antebellum South learned, covertly, in fragments, at enormous personal risk, from sources that were never the same twice. A page from a discarded almanac. The label on a crate. The back of a broadside nailed to a post at Barracks Crossing. Over years of this, he had assembled something functional, not literacy in any formal sense, but the ability to decode enough of a written document to grasp its essential content. And in the summer of 1837, a document had arrived at Harrow Hall that August very much needed to comprehend. The letter arrived at Harrow Hall in July of 1837, addressed to Elias Tanner, carried from Barracks Crossing by a boy who made the postal run 3 times weekly on a sway-backed mare. It was a routine delivery among several others, a bill of lading, a copy of a Columbia newspaper, a note from Eleanora's mother. It was opened at the dining room table by Elias Tanner on a Tuesday morning in the second week of July, while Delia cleared the breakfast items around him. She did not read over his shoulder. She did not need to. She watched his face. Elias Tanner was not a man given to visible emotion. But as he read that letter, a single page folded once, sealed with plain wax, something occurred behind his eyes that Delia had never witnessed before. It was not anger. It was something closer to calculation, the rapid internal movement of a man reassessing a situation he had believed to be under control and discovering it was not. He folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and left the dining room without finishing his coffee. Delia completed clearing the table. She went to the kitchen. She set down the plates she was carrying with a care that was excessive for the situation. The careful movements of a person managing something inside themselves that they cannot afford to release. Then she went to find Reuben. She did not inform him of what she had observed. Not yet. She was not certain enough. but she filed it in the precise, orderly archive she maintained behind the composed surface of her daily existence, and she waited. 3 days later, she found the letter. It had not been concealed in any sophisticated manner. Elias had placed it in the top drawer of the writing desk in his study, a room that Delia entered twice weekly to dust, and that Elias, in his confidence that the letter was simply another administrative document in a drawer full of them, had not thought to secure. She did not remove it. She would not have been able to explain a missing letter, and she was too careful for that kind of exposure. Instead, she memorized what she could of its first paragraph, which was sufficient, and closed the drawer, and left the room, and waited for the appropriate moment to locate August. The letter originated from a land agent in Colombia named Percival Oates. Its content, as best as August was later able to reconstruct from what Delia had memorized of the crucial passage, was this: Elias Tanner had at some point in the preceding years incurred a substantial debt secured against Harrow Hall's enslaved population. The debt was overdue. The agent was writing to inform Tanner that if the balance was not satisfied before the end of the calendar year, the creditor, a man whose name appeared in the letter but that Delia had not been able to commit to memory, would move to enforce the security. This meant, in plain language, a forced sale, not of the land, not of the house, or the cotton gin, or the barn, or the livestock, but of the people. All of them, or enough of them to satisfy what was owed, which, by the agent's estimation, might involve as many as 30 individuals. In a community of 43, 30 was not a partial dissolution. It was an ending. August sat with this information for a considerable time before bringing it to Reuben. He sat with it the way one sits with something that has fundamentally altered one's world and cannot be unlearned. Then, on a Sunday evening in late July, when the light came low and orange across the stubble fields, and the air carried the particular fragrance of dust and cooling earth that August had known his entire life, he went to find the older man. Reuben listened without interruption. He sat on the step of his cabin, his hands clasped between his knees, his face performing the characteristic absolute deliberate stillness, and he listened until August had communicated everything there was to communicate. Then he remained quiet for an extended period. Then he said, in a voice too low to carry, "How much time do we have?" August informed him until the end of December at the latest. Reuben nodded. He gazed out across the fields at the fading light, at the familiar landscape of a place where he had spent 34 years of his existence. He regarded it with the specific quality of attention of a man contemplating the possibility that he was viewing something for the final time and deciding, very quietly, what action to take. "Then we have until October," he said. "Maybe November, not longer." August did not inquire why those months specifically. He understood. October was when the cotton was harvested, when the year's labor was complete, when the ground was dry, and the nights were sufficiently long to be significant. He understood because he had spent his entire existence paying attention to precisely such matters. What he did not yet understand was that Reuben had been contemplating this possibility, not this specific letter, not this specific creditor, but the fundamental instability of their situation and what it might ultimately demand, for much longer than July of 1837. Much, much longer. There were matters that Reuben carried within himself that he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. Matters pertaining not to Harrow Hall alone, but to the wider world, its geography, the pathways through it, the names of individuals and locations he had never visited but knew existed. To explain how Reuben had come to possess his knowledge, one must go back several years. One must go back to a summer evening in 1833 when a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from a town called Lancaster, some 50 miles to the north, arrived to perform repair work on the roof of the Harrow Hall barn and remained for 3 days. Tobias was not merely a carpenter. That is to say, carpentry was his means of earning money, and he was skilled at it. But it was not the sole work he performed during those 3 days at Harrow Hall. On the evening of his second day, while Elias Tanner was away at Barracks Crossing conducting business, Tobias and Reuben sat together in the barn until very late. And what passed between them was something that Reuben had held within himself ever since, with the care of a man who understands that certain kinds of knowledge are both precious and perilous. Tobias informed Reuben about routes, specific pathways with specific landmarks, a creek crossing here, a particular ridgeline there, the location of a safe house associated with a Quaker family 17 miles north, and a second contact point beyond that. He informed Reuben about timing, why autumn was preferable to spring, why new moon nights were preferable to full ones, why a Sunday departure, when the interval between the moment of disappearance and the moment of formal discovery was longest, was worth planning for. Tobias conveyed all of this in the specific practical language of a man who had assisted others in traveling this route before and who anticipated assisting others again. Reuben had listened to every word. He had posed questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that indicated to Tobias that the man across from him was not overwhelmed, was not dreaming, but was processing information with the disciplined attention of someone who understood that this knowledge might one day constitute the difference between everything and nothing. When Tobias departed the following morning, roof repaired, payment received, not another word exchanged regarding their discussion, Reuben spent 3 days doing nothing except working and thinking. Then he began to plan, slowly, carefully, over the following years, without ever permitting what he was planning to become visible in anything he said or did. He conversed with people, not all at once, not in any manner that could be characterized as a meeting, but one at a time, in the most natural of settings, in the field, in the barn, on Sunday evenings. He engaged in conversations that would have sounded to any observer like nothing more than ordinary exchanges between individuals who had lived alongside each other for years. But they were not ordinary exchanges. They constituted an assessment. He was determining who among the 42 other people at Harrow Hall would be willing to go, who was strong enough, not physically alone, but in that harder, deeper sense, who had ties elsewhere that would restrain them, who had children young enough to carry and old enough to walk. He was calculating weight, distance, risk, and will. By July of 1837, when August brought him Delia's news about the letter from Percival Oates, Reuben had been engaged in this work for 4 years. He had not informed even Delia of its full extent, not because he didn't trust her, but because in a world where discovery could emerge from any direction at any moment, knowing less was sometimes the safest form of protection. But now the timetable had altered. What had been a long, careful preparation with an unspecified future destination had become something with a deadline. And the first element that changed about the plan once Reuben permitted himself to acknowledge the urgency was that he had to begin informing people of matters he had not yet disclosed to them. That process of expanding the circle, of bringing more individuals into awareness of what was being planned, commenced in August of 1837 and continued with extraordinary care through September and into the first week of October. It was, by any measure, one of the most disciplined acts of collective planning that the Carolina backcountry had ever produced. And because it was executed by individuals who had been rendered legally invisible by the society surrounding them, almost no record of it was ever made. Almost no record, but not quite none. In the second week of September 1837, Elias Tanner granted permission for the Harrow Hall enslaved community to attend a Methodist camp meeting at a location called Peavy Grove, approximately 4 miles from the plantation. This was not unusual. Camp meetings, those great outdoor religious gatherings that periodically swept through the South, attracting both white and black attendees in numbers that could reach the hundreds, had become a fixture of backcountry life by the 1830s, and many plantation owners, Elias Tanner among them, permitted their enslaved workers to attend. The reasons were various and not always philanthropic. Some believed the Methodist emphasis on discipline and order served their interests. Others simply understood that the social release of a camp meeting temporarily reduced the pressure that otherwise accumulated in a captive community with no outlet. What plantation owners who permitted camp meeting attendance rarely anticipated was the extent to which those gatherings served a different purpose for the people who attended them, a purpose having nothing to do with Methodist theology and everything to do with the opportunity to be, for a few days, among a large crowd of individuals from many different properties, with a freedom of movement and conversation that ordinary plantation life never permitted. The Harrow Hall contingent, 28 people in total, the remainder being too young, too old, or too recently acquired to make the journey, arrived at Peavy Grove on a Thursday afternoon and departed on Sunday morning. During those 3 days, in the intervals between the preaching and the singing and the communal meals, conversations occurred that Elias Tanner never learned of and that no circuit rider ever documented. Reuben spoke with a man named Cyrus, who had come from a plantation near Society Hill and who had traveled further along the route that Tobias had described than Reuben had ever been. Cyrus confirmed certain details, the creek crossing, the ridgeline, and updated others, because routes changed over years. People relocated, houses that had been safe became unsafe, new contacts appeared where old ones had vanished. Delia spoke with a woman named Harriet, whom she had not seen in 3 years, and whose presence at the camp meeting was for Delia both a relief and a confirmation. Harriet possessed information about the land north of Lancaster that she had gathered over the course of 2 previous journeys that had not succeeded, 2 previous attempts to leave, both of which had been interrupted before they progressed more than a dozen miles from their starting point. She shared what she had learned from those failures with the specific generosity of someone who understands that her hard-won knowledge might enable someone else to succeed where she had not. Delia listened with tears in her eyes that she permitted herself to shed because a religious revival was one of the few places where tears did not require explanation. And August, quiet, watchful August, who had spent the 3 days of the camp meeting moving through the crowd with the unobtrusive attention of someone doing nothing more than searching for familiar faces, made contact with a white man. His name, as far as August was ever willing to confirm, was Edmund. He was associated with the Quaker network that Tobias had described to Reuben 4 years earlier, and his presence at a Methodist camp meeting was not incidental. He was there specifically to establish contact with exactly the kind of person that August turned out to be, someone planning to move, someone needing to know that there were others along the route anticipating them. Edmund and August conversed for 11 minutes, standing near the food tables in the open air of the campgrounds, their conversation indistinguishable to any observer from the dozens of other casual exchanges occurring around them. By the conclusion of those 11 minutes, August possessed 3 items of information he had not possessed before: a specific departure window, a first landmark, and a phrase, 3 words in English, that would identify him and his companions to the first contact point north of Harrow Hall. When the Harrow Hall contingent returned on Sunday morning, they were outwardly identical to when they had left. They resumed their tools and their tasks and their careful practiced expressions of routine compliance. But something had shifted in the atmosphere between them. Something that anyone paying very close attention might have detected in the manner that a slight but real change in atmospheric pressure can be sensed before weather conditions alter. Ward Driscoll, as it turned out, paid very close attention. He noticed at first in the evenings, something altered in the quality of the silence emanating from the cabins. Not louder, not more agitated, but different. The way a held breath differs from relaxed breathing, even when neither produces sound. He could not have articulated it precisely, which was in fact what made him most suspicious. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were informing him that something had changed. Following the camp meeting, in the first week of October, Driscoll commenced what he termed, in his own mental accounting, a closer observation. He adjusted his evening rounds. He varied their timing, sometimes before supper, sometimes after dark, sometimes in the early morning hours, never at the same time twice in the same week, so that no pattern could be anticipated. He observed who conversed with whom and when, and for how long. He noted who appeared tired in the mornings, suggesting late nights. He paid particular attention to Reuben, whose quality of stillness he had always found slightly unreadable in a manner that bothered him, and to August, whom he had earlier assessed as a valuable worker and now began reassessing through a different lens. He did not report his suspicions to Elias Tanner. Not yet. Partly this was professional. A good overseer did not present a plantation owner with problems without also presenting solutions. And Driscoll did not yet possess anything concrete enough to constitute a problem in the owner's terms. Partly it was something else, something harder to name, a kind of private satisfaction in the detection itself, in the sensation of being the only one in the main house who comprehended the shape of unfolding events. He wished to permit it to develop a little further before he intervened. That decision to wait, to observe, to allow matters to continue for a few additional days before taking action was the decision that would define everything that followed. Whether Driscoll ever understood this is unknown. He was not the sort of man to leave records of his private reasoning. What he left instead was an absence, his name appearing in the Harrow Hall accounts through October 13th and then nothing. Not a single verifiable document bearing his name after the night of the 14th. But we are progressing too rapidly. To comprehend the night of October 14th, one must first comprehend the 7 days preceding it, the days during which everything that had been quietly, patiently, invisibly constructed over years was compressed into its final, irreversible form. What do you suppose was occurring in those cabins during those long October nights, while Ward Driscoll adjusted his rounds, and Elias Tanner reviewed his accounts, and Eleanora Tanner played her piano in the parlor with the windows closed against the autumn chill? Share your theory in the comments below. We are interested in your thoughts about what was approaching. And if this narrative is conveying the sensation that something terrible and something necessary are about to arrive at precisely the same moment, you are correct. Remain with us. The 7 days before October 14th were, by every external account available, unremarkable. The cotton had been ginned. The bales were stacked in the gin house, awaiting transport to market. The fields were empty of their summer burden and stretched flat and brown in the autumn light. The weather had turned cool but not cold, the nights dropping into the 50s with a clear sky and a waning moon that by the 14th would be 3 days past new, meaning the night of October 14th would be very nearly moonless. Anyone who had spent time on a farm in the Carolina backcountry in the 1830s would understand what that signified. A moonless October night with clear skies and no precipitation was approximately as close to ideal traveling weather as the season permitted. Sufficient light from the stars to navigate by in open country. Cool enough to move quickly without exhaustion. Far enough past the conclusion of the growing season that the roads were quiet. No wagons transporting cotton to market at irregular hours. No extra traffic to observe strangers moving through the darkness. Reuben had understood from the beginning that timing was a matter of the calendar as much as anything else. He had learned from Tobias, and Cyrus had confirmed at the camp meeting, that the nights of a new moon were when experienced travelers moved. He had positioned his departure window in the 3rd week of October, and the waning moon of October 14th represented the beginning of that window. It was, in other words, not accidental. It had been selected. During those 7 days, the preparation that had been building for months was brought to its final stage. And the manner in which this was accomplished, the methods, the logistics, the extraordinary discipline of 43 individuals maintaining the appearance of complete normality while executing a coordinated departure, constitutes one of the most remarkable narratives of collective action in the antebellum South, even though it would remain largely unknown for nearly 4 decades. Supplies had been accumulated gradually over weeks, in quantities so small and so ordinary that no individual act of accumulation would register as unusual. Dried corn, salt pork, a length of rope, extra cloth. Each item obtained through the normal course of daily work, the small overflow of a harvest here, the set aside from a communal meal there, and cached in locations that Reuben had identified over the months of his planning, a hollow in a specific tree 200 yards behind the farthest cabin, a loose board beneath the floor of the old smokehouse that had been out of regular use since the spring. Nothing that could not be explained innocently if discovered, and nothing so large in quantity that it suggested in isolation anything beyond ordinary life. There were also arrangements of a different kind, arrangements involving the people themselves and the question of who would depart and who would remain. This is the aspect of the story that is least documented and most difficult to reconstruct. And it is also the aspect that requires the most careful treatment because it involves choices made under conditions of extreme duress. And those choices were not simple or uniform. Not everyone at Harrow Hall was part of Reuben's plan. Not because they were excluded from trust, but because Reuben and Delia and August had, over the months of their preparation, developed a specific understanding of who could physically undertake the journey, and who, for reasons of age or health or the particular weight of their circumstances, could not or should not be asked to. There was a woman named Bess who was 63 years old and whose heart sometimes ceased functioning properly at night, leaving her gasping and gripping the frame of her cot until the episode passed. There was a man called Old Silas who was somewhere past 70 and who had informed Reuben directly and without apparent sorrow that his traveling days were behind him. There were 2 infants. There was a child of 4 named Clara, too old to be carried all night and too young to maintain the pace independently. These conversations between Reuben and the individuals who would remain, conducted in the quiet spaces of those 7 days, were by any measure the most difficult component. They were also, in the structure of this narrative, the component that most clearly reveals the nature of what was being undertaken. Not an impulsive flight, not a panicked response to immediate danger, but a considered, organized act by individuals who had thought carefully about every element of what they were attempting and had made deliberate choices regarding it under conditions where deliberate choice was itself a kind of revolutionary act. The people who would remain understood what was happening. Most of them had known for weeks. Their choice to remain, some made willingly, some made under the particular grief of understanding that a body can be willing but a 63-year-old heart might not, was not a betrayal and was not treated as such. Reuben had been explicit about this in the conversations he held with each of them individually. The individuals who remained would know nothing, would be able to state truthfully that nothing unusual had occurred, would be able to confront the interrogation that was certain to come, and it was certain to come, without the burden of knowledge that would place them at risk. This too constituted a form of planning, a form of care exercised under the most improbable of circumstances. By the evening of October 13th, the 43 people of Harrow Hall had, without a single visible rupture of their daily routines, sorted themselves into 2 groups, those who would depart and those who would remain. The supplies were in position. The route was memorized, never written, carried entirely in the minds of the individuals who would need it. The departure signal had been agreed upon. The contact phrase August had received from Edmund at the camp meeting had been communicated to 3 other individuals, so that if August became separated from the group in the first miles, the knowledge would not be lost. And Ward Driscoll, who had been observing very carefully for almost 3 weeks, had discovered nothing, which was itself a signal. The supper table at Harrow Hall was set for 9 on the evening of October 14, 1837. This detail, the set table, would become one of the most discussed elements of what Hiram Cook discovered upon his arrival the following morning. It implied normalcy. It implied that the residents of that house had sat down to a prepared meal and then risen and departed, or that the meal had been prepared and those who prepared it had never sat down. The distinction mattered and was never resolved. What is established is this: Delia prepared the evening meal in the kitchen house as she did every evening. The table in the dining room was laid, plates, cutlery, glasses, a covered dish of food still warm when Cook arrived the next day. And Delia did not serve it. At some point, between the preparation of that meal and the hour when Elias Tanner would have expected to sit down to it, Delia walked out of the kitchen house, crossed the yard, and did not return. That walk across the yard, a distance of perhaps 40 feet, a journey she had made hundreds of times, was the moment when everything Reuben had planned for 4 years became irreversible. The question of exactly what transpired in the main house that evening, what Elias and Eleonora and Garrett knew or suspected or did, is one that the subsequent investigation never adequately answered, in part because the individuals who could have answered it were either not speaking or not believed, and in part because the official record of that investigation was, as we shall see, subject to pressures having nothing to do with the pursuit of truth. What we know is that by the time the October darkness had fully settled over the Harrow Hall property, somewhere between 8 and 9 in the evening, by the most reliable of the later accounts, there was no sound emanating from the cabins, not the ordinary sounds of an evening, not voices, not movement, not the sounds of children, nothing. Just the wind off the fields and the dry rattle of the cotton stalks and the silence. And the silence was total. To comprehend how 43 individuals depart from a plantation in a single night without being detected until morning, one must abandon the assumption that disappearance necessitates concealment. It does not necessarily. Sometimes the most effective form of disappearance is not hiding but movement. Moving at the appropriate speed in the appropriate direction at the appropriate time with a sufficient head start that detection, when it arrives, comes too late to matter. The departure was not a single moment. It was a sequence orchestrated with the kind of operational precision that one would not anticipate from individuals who had never conducted a military campaign, until one remembers that the entire existence of those individuals had been a kind of continuous campaign, a daily navigation of threat and constraint that demanded exactly the kind of tactical thinking that an escape of this complexity required. The first to depart were the individuals with children. They went in the period after supper was finished and before the evening rounds, moving through the tree line at the rear of the property and heading northeast along the creek that Reuben had traversed 100 times in the ordinary course of farm work. They carried what they could carry and moved quietly, not because they had been instructed to, but because the individuals in that group had understood for longer than any of them could articulate that quiet was the language of survival. The second group departed 30 minutes later. They went in a different direction, due north through the Sims property adjoining Harrow Hall to the northwest, along a route that Reuben had identified because the Sims property ran unfenced on its northern boundary for a stretch of nearly 2 miles, meaning crossing it left no gate, no fence line, no obstacle requiring time. They would rejoin the first group at the creek crossing that Cyrus had confirmed at the camp meeting. The third group, the last to depart, consisted of Reuben himself, August, 2 other men, and a woman named Phoebe, who had insisted, despite an ankle that was not entirely healed, on being in the last group rather than the first, because she was one of the individuals who knew the complete route. If something had occurred, if an alarm had been raised, if the first 2 groups had encountered difficulty, she would know what action to take. Reuben was the last person to leave the Harrow Hall property. He stood for a moment at the edge of the tree line and looked back at the place where he had spent 34 years. He did not regard it sentimentally. He regarded it with the flat, clear attention of a man completing an assessment, confirming something. And then he turned and walked into the trees. The candles in the main house were still burning. The supper table was set. The kitchen fire, banked but not extinguished, cast a low orange glow through the kitchen house window. Everything appeared exactly as it would have appeared if the residents had simply stepped out momentarily and were about to return. They were not about to return. Hiram Cook was a farmer residing 3 miles from Harrow Hall who had an arrangement with Elias Tanner to deliver a load of split-rail fence posts on the morning of October 15. He arrived, by his own account given later to the barracks crossing magistrate, at approximately 7 in the morning with a wagon loaded with posts and a hired man named James riding alongside him on horseback. The first thing Cook noticed was the silence. He was not a man given to fancy. He stated this explicitly in the account recorded by the magistrate that survives today in a county archive in partial form. He was a plain man, he said, not given to fancy, and he was not in the habit of experiencing sensations regarding places. But he informed the magistrate that as he drove his wagon up the lane toward Harrow Hall and the silence pressed in around him, he felt a sensation he could not name. Not fear exactly, something adjacent to it. The sensation, he said, of a place that was holding its breath. The main house door was unlocked. He knocked, received no response, called out, nothing. He opened the door. The supper table was set. The food had remained there sufficiently long to become cold. The candles in the parlor had burned down to their stubs and expired, leaving pools of hardened wax on the candlesticks. Eleanora Tanner's piano was open, the lid raised, a piece of sheet music on the stand, as if the player had stepped away mid-practice. Upstairs, the beds were in various stages of being made or unmade, not the careful arrangement of individuals who had departed with intention, but the ordinary disorder of an interrupted day. There was no indication of struggle, not in the main house, not in the yard. The barn animals were present and had been fed at some recent point. The water troughs were not empty. The hay was sufficiently fresh. The cotton gin was secured with its normal padlock. The smokehouse was fastened. And the cabins were empty, not abandoned in the manner of a hasty departure. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken, but empty in the manner of rooms whose occupants have removed with them everything that mattered and left behind everything that did not. Pots on their hooks, tools in their corners, clothing worn out or too large or too small hanging on nails, the particular accumulation of objects that cannot undertake a journey and have been left deliberately, not accidentally. Cook traversed the length of the cabin row twice before speaking. Then he turned to James, who had followed him in silence, and uttered something that James remembered verbatim 40 years later when an interviewer finally located him in his 80s residing in a town in Ohio. What Cook said was, "They're gone. All of them." And then after a pause, "God Almighty." And then they departed to locate the sheriff. The sheriff of the county in which Harrow Hall was situated was a man named Porter Baines. He was 51 years old, had served in his position for 11 years, and was, by the accounts of those who worked with him, a competent and unsentimental individual who approached his duties with the particular efficiency of someone who had observed sufficient human behavior to cease being surprised by most of it. He arrived at Harrow Hall with 2 deputies at approximately 11 in the morning on October 15. He remained there for 4 hours. He interviewed Hiram Cook, the hired man James, and Elias Tanner, who had been located at a neighbor's property where he had apparently gone the previous afternoon. A timing that would become one of several details that investigators noted as unusual, though none of them ever pursued it fully. Eleanora Tanner was in the main house when Baines arrived. She had by that point been alone in the house since the previous evening, or so she claimed. She provided her account calmly, in the careful language of a woman who had spent years managing her expressions. She informed Baines she had heard nothing unusual during the night. She had retired at her usual hour. She had awakened to find the house as he was now observing it. Baines recorded her account. He wrote in the report he filed with the county court 3 days later that Mrs. Tanner appeared composed and cooperative. He did not record what she did not tell him. What she did not tell him, what would only emerge decades later from a source that none of the original investigators had considered consulting, is a subject we will return to. What Baines accomplished during his 4 hours at Harrow Hall was establishing the basic facts. 43 enslaved individuals were unaccounted for. No violence was evident at the location. The escape, for that was what he termed it in his report without apparent surprise or editorializing, appeared to have occurred during the night of October 14. He initiated what the relevant statutes required, notification to neighboring county sheriffs, a description of the missing individuals to be circulated through the standard channels, a request for any information regarding the passage of a large group through the region on the night of the 14th. Those requests produced, in the following 2 weeks, exactly nothing, not a single report of a sighting, not a single witness who had observed a large group moving through the backcountry on the night of October 14 or the days following, not one informant. And there were informants in every county of the Carolina backcountry, men who derived part of their income from reporting on the movements of runaway individuals or groups who had anything useful to contribute. This was itself extraordinary. A group of 43 individuals moving through populated territory in the middle of October should have been visible to someone. The absence of any sighting report was not conclusive. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it was, even to a man as unsentimental as Porter Baines, worth noting. He noted it in a single line at the conclusion of his report: "No reliable information has been received regarding the current location of the said individuals." And then, as far as the official record was concerned, the inquiry concluded. Just when we believed the investigation was progressing somewhere, just when it appeared that someone in authority was going to pose the questions requiring answers, the silence reasserted itself. Not the silence of a plantation at night, the silence of men with authority choosing not to examine too closely. If this narrative is already producing a sensation of unease, share it with someone who appreciates unsolved history and activate the like button so more individuals can learn what actually transpired here. Because the genuine narrative, the narrative of why no one discovered anything and what someone was concealing and what Elias Tanner knew, is only commencing. The official record of the Harrow Hall investigation, such as it was, runs to approximately 12 pages. Baines's initial report, 3 pages of witness statements, a document recording the formal notification of neighboring jurisdictions, and a brief summary filed 6 weeks later noting that the investigation had produced no actionable results and was being placed in abeyance pending new information. That final document, the one placing the inquiry in abeyance, was filed on November 29, 1837, and signed by Porter Baines and countersigned by the county judge, a man named Harlan Voss. It is the last official document in the Harrow Hall file for that year. It is also, upon careful inspection, a deeply unusual document. The first unusual aspect of it is the speed. 6 weeks from the disappearance of 43 individuals to the formal suspension of an investigation was, by the standards of the era, remarkably rapid, particularly for an event of this scale. The disappearance of 4 or 5 individuals from a single plantation was not uncommon in the Carolina backcountry, and those investigations routinely continued for months. The disappearance of 43 was unprecedented in living memory, and the formal closure of inquiry after 6 weeks was a departure from normal procedure so significant that at least one legal scholar examining the file in the 1890s characterized it as an administrative anomaly without obvious explanation. The second unusual aspect is a gap in the file. Between the initial witness statements and Baines's November summary, there should be, based on the normal structure of such investigations, a series of intermediate documents, follow-up reports from neighboring counties, records of any individuals detained and interviewed in connection with the case, notes from any additional witness interviews. These documents are not present in the file. They are not referenced in the November summary as having been received and found unhelpful. They simply are not there. The file progresses from the initial October documents directly to the November closure with nothing intervening. This could, of course, have a number of mundane explanations. Documents are lost, misfiled, damaged, destroyed by accident. Archives in the antebellum South were not maintained with the rigor of a modern records management system. The absence of intermediate documents does not by itself prove anything. But it is the third unusual aspect of the file that is most difficult to explain away. In the November summary, Baines wrote the following sentence, which does not appear to relate to anything else in the document and which has no obvious reference in the preceding text: "The matter having been reviewed with appropriate parties and the circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry, it is the judgment of this office that the foregoing case be closed." The circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry. That sentence is not standard legal language. It is not a formula that appears in any other document in the county records from that period. It is a sentence written by a specific man to convey a specific meaning, that someone, somewhere, had made a determination about what it was and was not desirable to pursue in the matter of Harrow Hall. Who those appropriate parties were, Porter Baines never identified. He died in 1851, leaving no memoir, no private papers, no correspondence that anyone has discovered addressing the Harrow Hall matter. The county judge, Harlan Voss, died in 1858. His papers were inherited by his son, who destroyed most of them following a fire that damaged his home in 1862. A fire that the local newspaper characterized as accidental and that no one had any particular reason at the time to question. The trail, in other words, went cold in the manner that trails go cold when the individuals who might have followed them chose not to. There is a detail in the Harrow Hall narrative that the official record acknowledges and then almost immediately abandons. And it is the detail that, once noticed, is the most difficult to cease contemplating. When Porter Baines arrived on the morning of October 15, Elias Tanner was not at Harrow Hall. He was at the neighboring property of a man named Abner Pruitt, a farmer who owned a modest piece of land about 1.5 miles to the south. Tanner had gone to Pruitt's property on the afternoon of October 14, hours before the departure of his entire enslaved workforce, and had remained overnight, arriving back at Harrow Hall on the morning of the 15th, just before noon, roughly an hour after Baines had commenced his investigation. The official explanation for this absence, as recorded in Baines's report, was that Tanner had gone to discuss a fence boundary dispute that had been ongoing between the two properties. Pruitt corroborated this in his own statement. Tanner had arrived in the afternoon. They had discussed the fence question over supper, and Tanner had remained overnight because the hour was late. This was plausible. Fence disputes were a constant feature of backcountry life. Overnight stays between neighboring landowners were not unusual. Baines apparently accepted it without further inquiry. But there are several aspects of this account that, when placed alongside the other elements of the story, create a discomfort that the official record does not address. The first is the timing. Elias Tanner departed Harrow Hall on the afternoon of October 14, the day of the departure, hours before it occurred. He was not present when his workforce walked out. Whether this was coincidence or design, his absence ensured that he was not in a position to respond in real time to whatever signal might have reached him from the property. The second is Abner Pruitt himself. In the years following October 1837, Pruitt continued to operate his farm without any apparent disruption to his circumstances. He was not wealthy, not politically connected, not a figure of any particular prominence in the county. He appeared, in short, to be exactly what the official record described him as, a neighbor. But his name appears in one other context that the official record does not mention. In 1834, Abner Pruitt had briefly employed as a hired hand for the spring planting season a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from Lancaster. The same Tobias who had come to repair the Harrow Hall barn roof in the summer of 1833 and had spent 3 days there in conversation with Reuben. Whether this connection signifies anything, whether Pruitt's relationship with Tobias had any bearing on the events of October 14, is something that cannot be established from the surviving record. It might be coincidence. In a world this small, in a county this sparsely populated, connections between individuals were often unremarkable. People knew each other. People hired the same workers across seasons and properties. But in a narrative that has already produced this many coincidences, another one presses against the edges of comfort. And then there is the matter of Eleanora Tanner. Eleanora Tanner was alone in the main house on the night of October 14, 1837. Her husband was at Abner Pruitt's farm. Her brother-in-law, Garrett, was, by her account and by the account recorded in Baines's report, at Barracks Crossing, where he had gone 2 days earlier and had not yet returned. This meant that on the night when 43 individuals walked out of Harrow Hall, the sole person in the main house was Eleanora. She had prepared the supper table. She had arranged the food. She had at some point during the evening closed the piano lid, but not entirely, leaving the sheet music in place, the lid resting at an angle against the stand. She had retired to bed, and she had heard nothing. This is what she informed Porter Baines, and this is what the official record contains. She heard nothing. She saw nothing. She had no warning and no prior knowledge. The question of whether this was true occupied the mind of one individual for a very long time, a woman named Adeline Spratt, the granddaughter of Eleanora Tanner's personal seamstress, a free woman of color from Columbia named Grace, who had made occasional visits to Harrow Hall in the years before 1837 and who had, according to family history passed down through Adeline's line, maintained a correspondence with Eleanora Tanner for several years after the events of that October night. Adeline Spratt was 73 years old in 1875 when she provided the testimony that is in many ways the most important document in the entire Harrow Hall narrative. She provided it to a journalist named Oliver Hatch, who was working for a paper in Columbia and had become interested in the story through a chance encounter with the partial Baines report in the county archive. Hatch had spent 2 years searching for anyone who might possess direct knowledge of the events of 1837. And when he discovered Adeline Spratt, he discovered something he had not anticipated. She possessed letters. The correspondence between Eleanora Tanner and Grace, Adeline Spratt's grandmother, had continued from 1838 until 1851 when Grace died. 11 letters survived, held in a box that Grace had kept and that had passed to her daughter and then to Adeline. They were not, for the most part, letters that addressed the events of October 14 directly. Eleanora Tanner was too careful for that. Having been by 1838 sufficiently shaped by the experience of living in a world where letters could be read by unintended eyes, she rarely stated plainly what she meant. But she conveyed it in other ways. The most significant letter is dated March 12, 1842. It was written 4.5 years after the night of October 14, and it concerns, ostensibly, a subject entirely unrelated to Harrow Hall, a piece of blue fabric that Eleanora was attempting to source from a merchant in Colombia. But embedded in the letter, with the particular indirection of a woman writing carefully, is this passage: "I have thought often of what you said when last we met about the nature of actions that cannot be undone and whether it is better to carry them in silence or to speak them to someone who will understand. I have decided, as I believe I was always going to decide, though it took me time to arrive at it, that silence is sometimes its own kind of truth. There are things I know about that November, things I have never spoken of to E or to anyone who might bring them back into the light. I do not repent of what I chose not to do, nor of what I chose to do, which may amount to the same thing in the end. I am well. I trust you are also well. The fabric, when you find it, should be a deep blue, and not the pale color they sold me last year, which was unsuitable. I do not repent of what I chose not to do." She mentioned November, not October. The month in which she had provided her testimony to Baines, not the night itself. But the sentence preceding it clarifies the reference sufficiently. What did Eleanora Tanner choose not to do? The most direct interpretation, the one that Oliver Hatch arrived at in 1875, and that historians who have since worked with this letter have generally supported, is this: Eleanora Tanner, alone in the main house on the night of October 14, knew what was occurring, or suspected it strongly enough that the distinction between knowing and suspecting was largely academic. She heard the silence descend upon the cabins, a silence she had lived alongside the sounds of her entire adult life at Harrow Hall and would have recognized the sudden complete alteration of. She understood, or intuited, what that silence signified, and she chose not to raise an alarm. She could have. She had access to the property's bell, the large iron bell used to signal emergencies and summon workers, mounted on a post at the edge of the yard. She could have gone to the neighboring property for assistance. It was dark. It was late. But it was not impossible. She could have taken action. She chose not to. Whether this was a principled act, a woman who had spent years in private moral reckoning finally making a choice aligned with what she had always understood to be right, or whether it was something more complicated, more ambivalent, more frightened, is something we cannot determine from a letter about blue fabric. What we can assert is that the silence that descended over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14 was maintained in the main house by a woman who perceived it and comprehended it and permitted it to stand. That constituted its own form of courage in a world where courage manifested in more shapes than the official record was usually willing to acknowledge. There is one more figure whose fate requires accounting, and it is the one whose disappearance the official record found most awkward to explain: Ward Driscoll. When Porter Baines arrived at Harrow Hall on the morning of October 15 and conducted his investigation, Ward Driscoll was not present. His quarters, a room attached to the rear of the barn, separate from both the main house and the cabins, were occupied. His belongings were there. His tools of office were in their usual places. His horse was in the barn. But Ward Driscoll was not. Baines noted this in his report and recorded it as a point requiring explanation. He listed Driscoll among the individuals whose whereabouts were unknown, not alongside the enslaved community, but as a separate category, with the neutral administrative language of someone who has discovered something he doesn't quite know how to address. The investigation produced no answer. Driscoll was never located. No account of his subsequent whereabouts, a new position on another property, a return to North Carolina, any verifiable life activity after October 14, 1837, was ever established. He simply vanished from the record, the way a man can vanish from a record when no one with the authority to investigate his disappearance possesses a strong interest in doing so. The question of what occurred to Ward Driscoll is the question that the Harrow Hall narrative has never been able to answer definitively. There are several possibilities, and each of them conveys something different about what transpired on that October night. The first possibility is that Driscoll discovered the departure in progress, that his watchful varied rounds finally brought him to the appropriate location at the appropriate moment, and that he attempted to intervene and was stopped. The absence of violence at the location makes this more difficult to sustain as a simple narrative, but it does not eliminate it entirely. A man halted in the dark by individuals who had everything to lose in a situation where the alternative to silence was catastrophic. The details of such an encounter would not necessarily leave visible evidence in the cabins or the yard. The second possibility is that Driscoll discovered the departure and, for reasons entirely his own, chose not to intervene. A man who had himself departed 2 previous positions under cover of night, whose own history was marked by sudden unexplained departures, might have observed what was occurring around him on the night of October 14 and made a private calculation having nothing to do with loyalty to Elias Tanner. Perhaps he perceived an opportunity. Perhaps he recognized in what he was witnessing something that his experience in similar situations informed him could not be halted and chose to remove himself from the equation rather than be associated with a failure of this scale. Men in his profession were compensated to prevent exactly this. A failure of this magnitude in a world where reputation was everything might have rendered his professional life effectively over. The third possibility is the one that no official document ever explored, but that, once raised, cannot be dismissed, that Ward Driscoll was not caught off guard at all, that he knew in advance what was being planned, that his weeks of careful observation had not failed to detect the preparation, but that what he had detected, and what he had contemplated in the quiet of his barn room, had affected something within him that his letter of recommendation from Gideon Falk and his career in the enforcement of the system he served would not have predicted, that Driscoll, the man hired to observe the people at Harrow Hall, had observed them and had chosen, ultimately, to look the other way. We cannot know. We possess only the absence, a horse in a barn, belongings on a shelf, a man who was present and then was not. And that absence, like so many aspects of Harrow Hall, refuses to resolve itself into certainty. What became of the 43 individuals who walked out of Harrow Hall on the night of October 14, 1837? The complete answer to this question would require years to assemble. And the assembly of it constituted the life's work of Oliver Hatch, the Columbia journalist who discovered Adeline Spratt in 1875 and who spent the last 2 decades of his existence following threads through archives, personal testimonies, church records, and the fragmented documentary trail that the Underground Railroad and its participants left deliberately scattered in the years before and during the Civil War. What Hatch had established by the time of his death in 1892 was this: 27 of the 43 individuals who departed Harrow Hall in October 1837 reached free territory. The route they traveled, confirmed by the accounts of contact point keepers along the way, several of whom provided testimony to Hatch or left records that he was able to access, went from the South Carolina backcountry north through North Carolina, then into Virginia's western counties and onward through the mountains, avoiding the coastal routes where surveillance was heaviest. The journey required 11 days by the best of Hatch's estimates. 11 days on foot with children, carrying what could be carried, moving at night, and resting in the concealed spaces of a network of individuals who were risking everything to provide for them. Of the 27 who arrived in free territory, Hatch was able to establish the subsequent lives of 17. Some settled in Pennsylvania. Several progressed further north. 2 eventually crossed into Canada. One woman, Hatch identified her only by her first name, Phoebe, was by 1875 residing in Ohio and was the matriarch of a family of 11, the grandmother of children who had never known the term plantation except as history. She was, Hatch wrote, a woman of such self-possession and directness that an hour in her company entirely altered my sense of what the people of Harrow Hall had accomplished. He never discovered Reuben. He discovered evidence that Reuben had reached the first contact point, the Quaker safe house north of Lancaster. But after that, the trail became quiet in a manner that suggested to Hatch, not death, but intentional obscurity. A man who had spent 4 years planning the most careful escape in the county's history would not, upon arriving in free territory, advertise his whereabouts. Reuben, wherever he ultimately settled, had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible when invisibility served him. August, Hatch believed, had settled somewhere in the vicinity of Philadelphia by 1840. He discovered a reference in a Quaker community record to a young man of the appropriate age, the appropriate physical description, who had arrived in the city in the winter of 1838 and who had subsequently been assisted in finding employment by a member of the Quaker meeting. The entry in the record identified him only by his first name. It noted that he could read and was eager to learn more. Of the 16 individuals who did not reach free territory, those who had remained at Harrow Hall and the 16 among the departing 43 who became separated from the main group or turned back in the first days, the records are more sparse and the narratives less kind. Those who remained were interrogated, not gently, in the weeks following October 14. The official record does not preserve the content of those interrogations in any detail. What it preserves is the notation in the county records that no information of actionable value was obtained, which was true because the individuals who remained had been protected from that knowledge with exactly this moment in mind. Delia was among those who reached free territory. This is known because of a single document, a letter written in a hand that scholars who later examined it characterized as unpracticed but precise, dated January 4, 1838, addressed to a woman in Colombia whose identity is not established. The letter is brief. It states, among other things, that the writer has arrived safely at a location she declines to name, that she is well, that she is grateful for what cannot be named, and that she hopes the person reading the letter understands that what was done with full knowledge and full will. The letter is signed with a single initial, D. Oliver Hatch believed it was Delia. The handwriting, unpracticed, as if the writer had only recently learned, was consistent with someone who had been taught to write in her adult years under conditions of great constraint. The date, 3 months after October 14, aligned with the timeline, and the phrasing, what was done with full knowledge and full will, possessed the specific quality of someone who understood that she was writing for a record, even if the record consisted only of a single page and a single letter that might never be discovered. Full knowledge and full will. Those 5 words constitute as close as we come in the documentary record of Harrow Hall to a direct statement of what transpired on October 14, 1837, and why. Elias Tanner spent the 3 months following October 14 in a state that his neighbors, those who observed him during that period, characterized variously as agitated, distracted, and, in the words of one observer who knew him well, a man who has looked into a room he didn't expect to see and cannot decide whether to describe what was in it. He did not pursue legal action. This, given the legal framework of the era, is remarkable. Enslaved people were property under the law of South Carolina, and the law provided specific mechanisms for pursuing their recovery, including legal actions against anyone who had assisted in their escape. That a plantation owner who had just lost 43 individuals, an asset of enormous monetary value by the brutal arithmetic of the slave economy, did not pursue these legal remedies with any apparent vigor is a departure from normal behavior that the official record does not explain. The debt to the creditor named in Percival Oates's letter, the debt that had precipitated the urgency of Reuben's plan, was, according to later county records, settled in February of 1838. The settlement was made at a substantial discount to the original amount, suggesting that the creditor, understanding that the security for the debt no longer existed, accepted what he could obtain rather than nothing. Elias Tanner remained at Harrow Hall for another 4 years, operating the property with hired labor, before selling it in 1841 to a man from Georgia who had no connection to the previous history of the place. The buyer never learned why the fields behind the main house felt different from other fields. He never learned why the cabin row possessed the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited and then departed rather than simply abandoned. He never inquired. He had purchased land and a house, and that was what he possessed. Elias Tanner relocated to Columbia after the sale. He died there in 1853. His death notice in the Columbia newspaper characterized him as a former planter of Lancaster District, known as a man of industry and sound character. It mentioned no wife. Eleanora had died in 1847 in circumstances that the records describe only as an illness of the lungs, brief and severe, and no children. It mentioned no unusual circumstances of his later years. It mentioned nothing about October 1837. It mentioned nothing about 43 individuals. Nothing at all. When Oliver Hatch discovered Adeline Spratt in a house on the outskirts of Columbia in the autumn of 1875, she was 73 years old and had been waiting, in a sense, for someone like him to appear for a considerable time. She possessed the 11 letters from Eleanora Tanner. She possessed the oral history of her grandmother, Grace, preserved with the care of someone who understands that oral history, when written records fail or are destroyed, is the only archive remaining. She possessed her own memories. She had been a child during the years of her grandmother's correspondence with Eleanora, and she had heard things in the manner that children who are considered too young to understand nevertheless hear and retain. She had carried all of this for 38 years, through the war and its aftermath, through Reconstruction and its failures, through every change that had swept through the South in the decades since that October night. And she had never spoken of it publicly because there had never been anyone to speak to who would comprehend. Hatch spent 3 days with her. He took extensive notes. He was, by his own account in the introduction to the manuscript he eventually produced, a manuscript that was not published during his lifetime and that survived in a single copy in a private archive in Pennsylvania, shaken by the experience in a manner that his years of journalism had not prepared him for. "I had gone looking for a mystery," he wrote. "I found instead a record of human determination so thorough and so carefully made that I was ashamed to have called it mysterious. The mystery had always been in the absence of the record, not in the events themselves. The events were comprehensible enough. It was the silence that had been imposed on them for 38 years that required explanation. And that explanation, when it came, was the most ordinary and most terrible of things. The silence had been maintained because the truth was inconvenient for the people with the power to decide what was documented and what was not." He spent the next 17 years attempting to complete the record. He discovered more contact point keepers. He discovered church records in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He discovered the Quaker meeting document that referenced August. He discovered, in an archive in Greensboro, North Carolina, a single line in an old account book belonging to a man named Calvin Hester, a man who the surrounding entry suggested had some connection to the network of assistance that ran through the Carolina and Virginia backcountry in the 1830s, that read, October 17, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. Movement continued north. 27 souls, 3 days after departing Harrow Hall, still together, still moving. The manuscript Hatch produced runs to several hundred pages. It was never published. After his death, it passed through several hands before ending up in a private archive in Philadelphia, where it remained largely unexamined until a historian working on a broader study of antebellum escape networks in the 1920s encountered it and produced a brief account of its contents. That account was published in a small academic journal and generated little attention at the time. The Harrow Hall narrative did not enter the broader historical record in any substantial way until the mid-20th century, when the growing field of African American history began the systematic work of recovering exactly the kind of story that had been deliberately and methodically suppressed. By then, the individuals it concerned had been gone for 100 years. There is a manner in which the conventional telling of escape narratives, the way they have most often been presented when they have been presented at all, emphasizes the danger, the pursuit, the narrow escapes, the dramatic reversals of fortune. These elements are real, and they matter, but they can, if they become the sole frame, obscure something else about what transpired at Harrow Hall, the extraordinary degree to which what occurred there was not a dramatic breaking free, but a deliberate, organized, collectively willed act of the plainest kind. Reuben did not escape. He planned. He spent 4 years in patient, methodical preparation, carrying knowledge he had received from a carpenter in 1833 and transforming it slowly into a structure capable of supporting 43 individuals through 11 days of travel to a destination none of them had ever seen, but all of them believed in. Delia did not flee. She observed. She read the letter in the study drawer, and she understood it, and she waited for the appropriate moment to share what she knew. And she managed her own fear with such discipline that the men whose household she worked in, and the overseer whose rounds she had memorized, and the institutional machinery of an entire system of social control, none of them detected it. August did not run. He listened. He learned to read in the stolen fragments of a year when he was 12 years old. And he used that reading 20 years later to receive information that 11 minutes of conversation at a camp meeting was insufficient to fully convey and to transmit it to the individuals who required it. The silence that descended over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of purpose. It was the thing that occurs when a community that has been informed by every mechanism available to the society surrounding it that it possesses no agency, no future, no choices, no will that matters, demonstrates in a single night that it has been planning otherwise. That is the silence that Hiram Cook sensed when he drove his wagon up the lane on the morning of October 15th, and the air pressed in around him in a manner he couldn't name. He was standing in the aftermath of something that the world he inhabited had been designed to render impossible, and the impossibility of it, the sheer, quiet, devastating fact of it, was what made the place feel to a plain man not given to fancy like somewhere that was holding its breath. The breath had already been released. The individuals were already miles distant. The man from Georgia who purchased Harrow Hall in 1841 cultivated the fields and worked them for a decade and sold the property in 1852 to a family who utilized it for timber. By the time of the Civil War, the cotton gin had been dismantled and the barn had partially collapsed, and the main house was occupied by a family with no connection to the Tanners and no knowledge of what had transpired there 25 years before. The cabin row, the line of structures behind the main house where Reuben and Delia and August and 40 others had lived and planned and prepared, was gradually absorbed back into the vegetation that the Carolina backcountry is always attempting to reclaim from human occupation. By the end of the century, the structures were gone. The clearing remained for a time, and then it too was overgrown. And by the time the first serious historical inquiries commenced in the mid-20th century, there was no physical trace of the cabins that could be definitively identified. The main house stood until 1879, when it was damaged in a storm, and the then-owner chose not to repair it. It was demolished the following year. The location passed through several more owners in the decades that followed, each less aware than the last of what had transpired there, until by the early 20th century, it was simply a piece of land in the Carolina backcountry, flat, heavy, the kind of terrain that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, where the tree line pressed close and the sky above the cleared patches was always somehow smaller than anticipated. The well near the yard, which had been the practical center of the property's daily life for decades, lasted longest. It appeared on a property survey in 1903, described simply as an old well, dry. It was filled in at some point after that. Oliver Hatch's manuscript, the most complete account of the Harrow Hall narrative ever assembled, remained in a private archive in Philadelphia until the 1960s, when it was donated to a university library. It is accessible to researchers. It has been cited in a handful of academic works. It has never been the subject of a popular history, a newspaper feature, or a commemorative marker. The individuals it documents never received formal recognition from any institution. There is no plaque at Barracks Crossing, which is now, in any case, a location that exists only on old surveying charts, commemorating the night of October 14, 1837. There is no marker on the land that was once Harrow Hall. There is no official record that acknowledges what was planned there, what was risked there, what was accomplished there. The silence was very thorough. It performed its work for a very long time. But silences, even thorough ones, have a tendency to develop small fissures. A letter survives in a box. An elderly man in Ohio recalls what Hiram Cook uttered when he walked the cabin row. A journalist discovers a woman in Colombia who has been waiting 38 years for someone to arrive and pose the appropriate questions. A single line in an account book in a Greensboro archive, October 17, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. The silence of Harrow Hall was not the silence of nothing. It was the silence of something that had been concealed. And the thing that had been concealed, when it was finally brought into the light, was not a mystery. It was not inexplicable. It was not a ghost story or a tale of the supernatural or an unsolved crime that baffled investigators for generations. It was instead what 43 individuals decided to accomplish with one October night when the moon was dark and the air was cool and every year of preparation finally, precisely, arrived at its moment. It was, when all was said and done, the most human thing imaginable. The most challenging aspect of the narrative, and perhaps the most important, is this: the night itself was only the conclusion of something, not the beginning. The beginning was Reuben seated on the step of his cabin on a Sunday evening in late July, listening to August inform him about a letter in a study drawer and saying, in a voice too low to carry, "Then we have until October," and deciding, quietly, what action to take. In the spring of 1876, Oliver Hatch published a short article in the Columbia paper, a condensed version of what he had learned from Adeline Spratt and his years of research. Stripped of the names that might have exposed individuals still living to legal or social risk. He published it under a cautious headline and anticipated little response. He received, over the following 6 weeks, 23 letters. 11 of them were hostile, men who informed him, in language ranging from the formally disapproving to the explicitly threatening, that he had no business disturbing the settled history of the region, that his account was inaccurate, that he should concern himself with more appropriate subjects. 2 of the hostile letters were unsigned. 12 of them were something else. They originated from individuals who had heard, over the years, fragments of the narrative, a grandmother's recollection, a line in an old letter, a thing a neighbor once said and then did not repeat. They originated from individuals who had always known, in the specific manner that communities know things they have decided collectively not to speak aloud, that something had transpired in the backcountry in October of 1837 that the official record did not contain. One letter, and signed, written in a careful and unpracticed hand, contained only a single sentence: "They made it, most of them." I know this because I am one of the ones who helped them along the way, and I have kept that knowledge in me for 39 years, and I am glad at last that someone has asked. Oliver Hatch never identified the author of that letter. He stated in his private papers that he possessed a strong suspicion, a suspicion so strong that he was certain it was not a suspicion at all, but that confirming it publicly would serve no purpose that justified the risk to the individual who had written it. He preserved the letter within the manuscript. It remains there. The manuscript remains in the university library. The letter remains unattributed. And Harrow Hall, the land that was once Harrow Hall, the flat and heavy ground where 34 years of Reuben's existence had been spent, where Delia had cleared breakfast dishes and interpreted a man's face and filed what she observed in the archive behind her eyes, is still out there somewhere in the Carolina backcountry, absorbed back into the landscape, holding whatever it holds in the silence that it learned long ago to maintain. What are your thoughts on this narrative? Do you believe we have uncovered everything there is to understand about the night of October 14, 1837? Or are there answers still buried in archives that no one has yet considered opening? Share your theory in the comments below. If this narrative affected you, if it prompted you to question what gets documented and what gets quietly set aside, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, activate the notification bell, and join us here for the narratives that history attempted to forget. We will see you in the next one.